My husband didn't leave me during an argument. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic goodbye. He left calmly like someone checking out of a hotel after a pleasant stay. One morning, the suitcase was by the door. By evening, he was gone, and not alone. He walked out for a younger woman and took the entire family with him, our children, our shared friends, even the future I thought we were all still building together. They were heading abroad for a wedding, not mine. His. I remember standing in the kitchen that morning, staring at the mug in my hands long after the coffee went cold, trying to understand how 27 years of marriage could end without a single conversation. No explanation, no discussion, just an announcement dressed up as inevitability. A few days after they landed overseas, my phone vibrated. I already knew who it was before I looked. One message, no greeting, no name. Just words that felt like a door slamming shut. "Don't be here when we return." I read it twice, then a third time, still no emotion behind it, just instruction, as if I were clutter, as if I were furniture he planned to replace. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I suddenly realized he expected me to react, to beg, to plead, to ask how I could fix something he had already destroyed. I gave him none of that. I said nothing. In that silence, that was the first thing I ever did that truly unsettled him. Before we go further, take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy real, emotional stories with unexpected turns, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read them all, now let me tell you what those weeks of silence were really like. While they were overseas, celebrating and smiling for photos, life didn't stop for me. It slowed, painfully. The house echoed in ways I had never noticed before. Every room reminded me of something we had built together, the staircase he insisted on, the garden I maintained alone, the walls that held decades of laughter, arguments, birthdays, and quiet nights that once felt safe. And yet, for the first time in years, I was alone enough to think clearly. I stopped replaying his words. I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong, and I started noticing something far more important. He had left quickly, too quickly. Not like a man ending a marriage, but like someone trying to get away before questions were asked. I began opening drawers I hadn't touched in years, files, receipts, folders he never cared about because, as he liked to say, that stuff bores me. Funny thing about boredom, it's usually where the truth hides. Days passed, then weeks. They stayed abroad longer than planned. Photos appeared online, glasses raised, laughing faces, arms wrapped tightly around someone new. They looked happy, carefree, as if the life we shared had already faded into something insignificant. Meanwhile, I packed slowly. Not because I was obeying his message, but because I was deciding what mattered. I didn't rush. I didn't cry over every item. I kept only what was truly mine, memories, documents, and things that told my story, not his version of it. Everything else suddenly felt replaceable. The day they were scheduled to return, I didn't wait inside the house. I didn't stand by the window. I sat in my car parked across the street, watching, waiting. They arrived laughing, bags in hand. Carefree, and then they stopped, because where our home once stood, there was nothing, just empty land, freshly leveled, silent. And for the first time since the message arrived on my phone, I smiled. But how we got there and why everything he thought he owned was already gone, that's what I'll tell you next. While they were gone, everyone assumed I was falling apart. That's the role people expect a woman like me to play when her husband leaves, devastated, confused, desperate to be rescued. I let them believe it. Neighbors offered awkward smiles. Friends sent vague messages like thinking of you without ever asking real questions. Even my own children didn't call. And honestly, that silence hurt more than his message ever did. But what none of them realized was that I wasn't collapsing. I was waking up. For the first time in years, there was no one rushing me, interrupting me, or telling me we'll deal with it later. So I started dealing with it. I walked through the house slowly, not emotionally, but deliberately, opening drawers, cabinets, and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. That's when I noticed something strange. Everything important had always been handled by me. The mortgage paperwork, the insurance policies, the renovation permits, the tax documents. He liked to joke that numbers bored him, that legal things gave him a headache, so I handled them for decades. At first, I was just organizing, making sense of what my life looked like without him. But the more I looked, the more questions surfaced. Why was my name the primary signature on so many documents? Why were certain accounts registered only to me? Why had he always brushed off conversations about ownership with a laugh and a wave of his hand? That curiosity turned into focus, and focus turned into clarity. I realized something unsettling. My husband didn't just underestimate me, he had never really known me. While he was busy planning his new life, I began tracing the old one piece by piece. I found documents from years ago when we first bought the house. I remembered that day clearly. His credit had been shaky back then. Mine wasn't. I had insisted we do things the safe way. He agreed, relieved to let me handle it. That decision, made casually over coffee and laughter, was now sitting quietly in black and white. And it changed everything. Days passed. I stopped crying altogether. Instead, I started planning. Not revenge, not yet, just protection. Because one thing became painfully obvious. He assumed I would disappear quietly. He assumed I would pack my things, sign whatever papers he sent, and remove myself from the life he was redesigning. What he never considered was that I might stay long enough to understand what was really mine. That was when the idea formed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a calm certainty that surprised even me. If he wanted me gone when they returned, then I would be gone, just not in the way he expected. I contacted professionals, not emotionally, efficiently. I asked questions I had never asked before, questions about ownership, about authority, about timing, and with every answer something inside me settled, because the truth was simple: the life he thought he was walking back into no longer existed. Meanwhile, they continued posting photos, laughing faces, glasses clinking, carefree smiles. He looked proud, like a man who believed he had won. And maybe at one time he would have, but I wasn't that woman anymore. The day before their return, I packed the last box. I left the house spotless. Empty, silent. I walked through each room one final time, not in grief but in gratitude. That house had been my classroom, and the lesson was finally complete. That night I didn't sleep, not from anxiety, from anticipation. Because I knew something he didn't. By the second week of their trip, I stopped checking the calendar. Time felt different when no one was waiting for you to fail. I woke up early every morning, not from anxiety, but from habit, the kind that lingers after decades of caring for everyone except yourself. The house was quiet in a way that used to scare me. Now it steadied me. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had signed birthday cards, school forms, and countless documents he never bothered to read. That table became my command center, folders spread out, notes neatly stacked, questions written and rewritten until the answers became undeniable. I wasn't searching for ways to hurt him. I was searching for the truth. And the truth was inconvenient for him. I discovered that the house he loved to brag about, the one he showed off to friends as proof of his success, was never as simple as he believed. It wasn't arrogance that made him careless. It was entitlement. He assumed that because he lived there, it belonged to him. Because he earned money, it was his. Because he decided to leave, everything would simply rearrange itself around his desires. That assumption was his greatest mistake. Every call I made that week was calm, professional, detached. I didn't explain my emotions, I explained facts. I asked about timelines, procedures, options. And with every conversation, the shape of my future became clearer. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I found something that made me sit back and breathe slowly. A document from years ago. Signed, stamped, final. I remembered the moment it was created. He was late that day again, so I had handled it myself. At the time, it felt insignificant. Now it felt decisive. I closed the folder and realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would have rushed me. Anger would have made me reckless. What I felt instead was calm, the kind that comes when you finally understand your position on the board. I wasn't losing. I was simply done playing the role he assigned me. Friends started calling more frequently as the return date approached. Their concerns sounded rehearsed. "So, what are you going to do when they get back?" I answered vaguely. "I'll be gone." That satisfied them. They assumed I meant I was leaving town, starting over quietly, accepting my place in the aftermath. I let them assume whatever made them comfortable. Because comfort has a way of blinding people to what's really happening. The night before they were scheduled to return, I didn't pack clothes. I packed certainty. I took only what I needed: documents, personal items. Things that carried meaning, not weight. Everything else stayed behind, not as a sacrifice but as proof that I wasn't clinging. I wasn't chasing. I wasn't trying to preserve something that had already expired. That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was afraid of seeing him again, but because I knew he expected something very specific from me: tears, regret, submission, and I was about to give him none of it. Morning came quietly. The sky was clear, ordinary. I dressed carefully, not to impress but to remind myself who I was becoming. Then I drove away from the house for the last time. I didn't look back. Instead, I parked across the street, engine off, hands steady on the steering wheel, and I waited. I thought about the message again. "Don't be here when we return." He thought that was a threat. What he didn't understand was that it was permission. Permission to erase the version of myself that waited for approval. Permission to step aside and let consequences take their place. Cars began to appear, luggage rolling, voices carrying laughter. They were early, relaxed, unprepared. I watched them pull into the space where a driveway used to be, and when they stepped out, the laughter stopped. Because there was nothing to step into, no door, no walls, no proof that the life they left behind had waited for them. Just empty land and silence. But that moment, the exact second when realization hit them, that deserves its own telling. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. That was the strangest part. They stood there, smiling, squinting, looking around, as if the house might suddenly reappear if they just blinked hard enough. Luggage wheels rattled uselessly over dirt. Someone laughed again, awkwardly this time, like the joke hadn't landed. Then the silence set in, the kind that doesn't arrive all at once but creeps in when certainty begins to crack. He turned in a slow circle, once, twice. His shoulders stiffened. The younger woman stopped smiling first. Her laugh faded into confusion as she looked from him to the empty land, then back again. "This isn't funny," she said. He didn't answer. He took a few steps forward, boots crunching against gravel where the front walkway used to be. There was no porch, no door, no familiar outline, just a clean stretch of earth where a life once stood. That's when panic showed up. Not loudly, not yet. It flickered behind his eyes as he reached for his phone. Dialed, redialed, again. I didn't answer. I stayed in my car, engine off, seat reclined just enough to stay unseen. I watched him pace. Watched him gesture wildly as if someone invisible had betrayed him. His voice carried across the open space now that walls no longer softened it. "Where is it? What do you mean it's gone? This is my house." The words echoed uselessly. Ownership sounds very different when there's nothing left to own. The younger woman's tone shifted, sharp, urgent. "You said this was taken care of." He waved her off, still dialing, still believing there was a mistake to be corrected. That's the thing about people like him. They don't accept reality at first, they negotiate with it. One of the children arrived next, then another. Confusion stacked on confusion. Questions flew in all directions. No one looked at the empty land for long, they looked at him. And slowly I saw it land. Not blame, not yet, but doubt. The kind that makes people realize they trusted the wrong person. That's when I opened my car door, not dramatically, just enough. The sound made him turn. Our eyes met across the space that used to be our life. His face drained of color. Shock froze him in place. I stepped out slowly, calmly, no rush. I wasn't there to explain myself, I was there to be seen. "You said not to be here when you returned," I said quietly. My voice carried clearly in the open air. "I wasn't." He stared at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. "What did you do?" he finally asked. No anger yet. Just disbelief. "I did exactly what you asked," I replied. "I left." He laughed once, sharp and brittle. "This isn't funny. Where's the house?" I gestured behind him. "It's gone." The younger woman stepped closer to him. Her voice was tight now. "You told me this was yours." He ignored her. "This is illegal," he snapped, turning back to me. "You can't just make a house disappear." I met his eyes. "I didn't make it disappear." I paused. "I made a decision." That's when the truth began to surface. Slowly, painfully, because the moment he realized something had happened without his permission, the balance shifted. He demanded answers. I gave none, not there, not in front of everyone. I didn't owe explanations anymore. I had already done the work, and the consequences had already arrived. Sirens weren't needed. Lawyers weren't called, not yet. All that mattered was the look on his face when certainty finally collapsed. When he understood that the life he walked away from hadn't waited. hadn't frozen in place, hadn't begged to be chosen again. I returned to my car without another word. As I closed the door, I saw it in his eyes. Fear, not of me, but of what he had never bothered to understand. And as I drove away, I knew the hardest part wasn't behind us. It was just beginning. I didn't go far. I parked 2 streets away and sat there longer than I expected to. Not to celebrate, not to cry, but to listen. Even from a distance, voices carry when there are no walls left to contain them. I could still see them in my rearview mirror, scattered, restless, unsure of who to blame first. That's when the phone calls started. One after another, missed call, voicemail, another call. I let them ring. Because I knew something important was happening on that empty land. The realization was spreading. At first, he had been angry, loud, demanding, convinced someone else would fix it for him. But anger doesn't last long when there's nowhere to direct it. Then came confusion. Voices lowered, arguments turned inward. The younger woman stopped clinging to his arm and started standing apart. Distance does that. It exposes cracks people don't want to admit are there. I imagine the questions forming in her mind. Why didn't he tell me this could happen? Why didn't he seem surprised enough? Why did he look afraid? Fear is contagious. Once it appears, everyone catches it. I checked my phone again. A message finally came through, not an apology, not concern, just accusation. You had no right. I read it once, then locked the screen because rights are funny things. People only question them when they lose something they assumed was guaranteed. That night, I didn't go home. There was no home to return to. I stayed somewhere quiet and neutral, letting the adrenaline drain out of my system. Only then did exhaustion hit. Not physical, emotional, the kind that settles into your bones after you've carried too much for too long. The next morning, the calls started again, but this time they weren't angry, they were nervous. Short messages, careful wording, requests to talk things through. That's when I knew the power had fully shifted. When people stop demanding and start asking, it's because they're scared of the answer. I agreed to one meeting, not out of guilt. Out of closure, we met in a public place, neutral ground. He arrived early. That alone told me everything. He looked older, smaller, like a man who had finally realized the world doesn't rearrange itself around his desires. You blindsided me, he said, skipping any greeting. No, I replied calmly. You underestimated me, he leaned forward. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. I met his eyes without flinching. You embarrassed yourself when you treated a marriage like a temporary arrangement. He tried another angle, this time softer. Why didn't you fight for us? That one almost made me laugh. Because I was the only one who ever did. That's when the truth slipped out. Not about love, about control. He admitted he thought I would panic, that I would beg, that I would sign whatever papers he put in front of me just to keep peace. That I would be grateful for scraps of dignity. That was the moment I saw him clearly, not as my husband, but as a man who had never once imagined I might be capable of ending things on my own terms. He asked where I was staying. I didn't answer. He asked what I wanted. I told him the truth. I want distance. The younger woman never showed up. That didn't surprise me. She had already understood what he hadn't. That the life she thought she was marrying into had never belonged to him. By the time we stood to leave, his hands were shaking. What happens now? He asked quietly. I paused, long enough for him to feel the weight of uncertainty. Now, I said, you live with the decisions you made. And I walked away. Behind me for the first time there was no shouting, no insults, just silence. The kind that finally means something is over, but the consequences. They were only beginning. The legal part didn't explode all at once. It crept in quietly. That's how consequences usually arrive, not with drama, but with paperwork, certified letters, formal notices. Deadlines that don't care how shocked you still are. I received mine first. Clean, organized, expected. He received his later, and from what I heard, it hit him like a wave. Suddenly, nothing was simple anymore. Nothing could be worked out later. The assumptions he had lived on for years, that things would fall into place because they always had, began to collapse under scrutiny. Accounts were frozen, questions were asked, ownership was reviewed. And for the first time in his life, he had to explain himself without me quietly fixing things in the background. He called again, not angry, not accusing, careful, measured. That scared me more than rage ever did. I just want to understand, he said. I recognized the tone. It was the same one he used whenever something went wrong and he needed me to solve it. I didn't take the bait. You understand enough, I replied. You just don't like what you're learning? The younger woman disappeared completely after that. No calls, no messages, no appearances. She had come for a lifestyle, not a lesson. Once she realized the lifestyle was built on assumptions instead of reality, she did what people like that always do. She left. And this time, he was the one left behind. The children were next, confused, upset. Not because of what he'd done, but because stability had vanished. They reached out cautiously, questions disguised as concern, concern disguised as entitlement. Where are we supposed to go now? What's going to happen? Why didn't you stop this? I answered honestly. I didn't stop it because it wasn't mine to stop. That didn't sit well with them. It wasn't supposed to. For the first time, they were seeing me not as a buffer, but as a person who had reached her limit. He tried one last time. A message late at night, short, simple. We can still fix this. I stared at the words for a long time, because once upon a time I would have believed that. I would have convinced myself that fixing things was noble. That swallowing pain was strength, that staying silent was love, but I wasn't that woman anymore. I replied with 6 words. Some things don't get repaired. That was the end. After that, everything accelerated, meetings, signatures. Final decisions. I watched from a distance as his life reorganized itself without me. Smaller spaces, lower expectations, harder questions. Reality has a way of humbling people who mistake privilege for permanence. And through it all, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because I was no longer carrying what never belonged to me in the first place. One afternoon, weeks later, I drove past the empty land again. It was still quiet, still bare, still honest. No illusion, no pretending, just truth. And standing there, I realized something important. That place didn't represent loss, it represented freedom. Because a home built on disrespect is already gone, it just takes time for people to notice. And he finally had. All that remained now was acceptance. Silence feels different when it's chosen. For years, silence had been something forced on me, swallowed words, unasked questions, feelings pushed aside to keep the peace. But this silence, this one felt earned. The phone stopped ringing, no more late-night messages. No more cautious apologies disguised as negotiations. No more sudden concern from people who had ignored me when I needed them most. Life didn't become exciting overnight, it became steady. And after everything I'd lived through, steadiness felt like luxury. I moved slowly into my new routines, morning walks without rushing, coffee without checking my phone, evenings where no one expected anything from me. I noticed how much space had opened up, not just physically but emotionally. Space to think, space to breathe, space to remember who I had been before I learned to shrink myself. Sometimes memories surfaced unexpectedly. A laugh we once shared, a trip that felt happy at the time, a version of him that didn't seem cruel. Those moments didn't hurt the way I expected. They simply reminded me that love can be real and still end. Because love without respect eventually becomes something else, something heavier, something that drains instead of grows. One afternoon, I received a message from one of the children. It wasn't angry. It wasn't demanding. It was hesitant. They said they were trying to understand, that they hadn't realized how much I had carried, that things felt different now. I read it carefully, then I replied honestly. I didn't stop loving you. I stopped abandoning myself. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it shifted something important. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself. I was simply stating the truth. I also heard updates through others. He had downsized again, changed jobs, lost friends who had only been there for convenience. The younger woman was gone completely, replaced by silence just like he once replaced me. And for the first time, I felt no satisfaction in that, only understanding, because the same emptiness he created in others was now his to sit with. Late one evening, I drove past the empty land again, not out of habit, out of closure. The space looked different now. Grass had begun to grow. Nature doesn't mourn structures, it reclaims them. And standing there, I realized something quietly profound. That house wasn't my identity, neither was my marriage. Neither was the role I played for decades just to be chosen. I had mistaken endurance for purpose. I had confused loyalty with self-erasure, and I had believed that staying silent made me strong. But strength, I learned, isn't how much you tolerate, it's how clearly you know when to leave. I got back into my car and drove away for the last time, not looking back, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to prove. And that's when I knew the story wasn't about what he lost, it was about what I finally reclaimed. Chapter 8: What I Built After the ASHES. People think the hardest part is being left. It isn't. The hardest part is realizing how long you stayed after love stopped feeling safe. After everything was finalized, after the papers were signed and the noise finally settled, something unexpected happened. Nothing, no dramatic relief. No sudden joy, no victory speech, just quiet. And for the first time in my adult life, that quiet belonged to me. I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't replace him. I didn't try to prove anything to anyone. I let myself exist without explanation. Some mornings I woke up and forgot for a few seconds that my life had changed, and then I remembered. But the memory no longer hurt. It felt distant. Like recalling a storm you survived rather than one you were still trapped in. I rebuilt slowly, not a house, a life, one decision at a time. I chose where to live based on peace, not compromise. I chose how to spend my time based on joy, not obligation. I chose myself, something I hadn't done in decades. Occasionally, people would ask about him, where he ended up, how he was doing, if I ever missed him. I answered honestly, I don't miss the man he became. And that truth felt complete, because the man I married had disappeared long before he ever walked out with a suitcase. I heard later that he struggled, not dramatically, just steadily. The world didn't punish him, it simply stopped cushioning him, and without someone quietly fixing everything behind the scenes, he had to face himself. I didn't celebrate that, I didn't grieve it either. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. The children adjusted too, slowly, imperfectly, relationships changed. Some grew quieter, some grew stronger, and some fell away entirely. That's what happens when you stop sacrificing yourself to keep everyone else comfortable. But something else happened as well. I started recognizing myself again, the woman who made decisions, the woman who understood her own worth, the woman who didn't need permission to exist fully. One evening I sat alone, watching the sun go down, and thought about that message again. Don't be here when we return. He thought those words would erase me. Instead, they freed me. Because sometimes the thing meant to silence you becomes the moment you finally listen to yourself. And here's the lesson I wish someone had told me years ago. Love is not proven by endurance. Marriage is not measured by suffering. And loyalty should never require self-erasure. If someone treats you like something replaceable, believe them, and then replace the version of yourself that tolerated it. I didn't destroy a home. I walked away from a life that had already stopped loving me back. And in doing so, I finally came home to myself. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life stories like this, and tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you the longest. Sometimes, the end of one story is the beginning of the one you were always meant to live.